In this video, we will discuss how to give a good PowerPoint presentation. First of all is preparing a presentation, right? You have to prep a presentation, and if you want it to go well, there are several things you have to consider. First of all, a PowerPoint presentation is in many ways similar to preparing a paper. It takes time, and the more time you devote to it, the better it's going to be. And it often requires multiple drafts. Right, so you don't want to just say, well, now it's the day before my presentation, I better make my PowerPoint, and you do need a PowerPoint. You don't want to be like that. You want to say, okay, it's a week before my presentation, I need to start working on my presentation. Right, so don't wait till the night before. It won't be a good PowerPoint or a good presentation. Just like trying to write a paper the night before isn't very good. So that's one thing I really have to stress, is that it takes time, and you want to get started earlier rather than later. And it's similar to a paper in that, like I said, it takes time, but the more drafts you can make, the better. So you make your presentation, you sleep on it, and then the next day you look at it again, and you may decide you need to make some changes. I also want to stress you need to focus on content over form. Sometimes when people make a presentation, the presentation itself is beautiful. They've chosen a really nice background for their font or for their slideshow. They have all these cool animations that they use, but then there's no content. And I think that's kind of a temptation, right? We human beings, we like to kind of trick ourselves. So, it's like, okay, I need to make a good presentation. I'm going to spend a lot of time on my presentation, but I'm going to spend all that time doing all these fancy things. And then it's like, well, hey, I'm working and I'm having fun while I'm doing it. Isn't this great? But then there's no content. And the content's what's important, not the fancy stuff. So you want to get that down first before you worry about animations and things like that. Another example of this is that sometimes people will include all these really cool images, and they'll have them arranged in a really neat way, and they won't actually refer to them in their presentation. And so they spent all this time working on images and finding them and arranging them properly, and so they look nice, but then they don't talk about them. Well, why include them then? Right? You only have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of space on your PowerPoint slides. Why would you include images unless they directly connect to your presentation? Right? So you want to be very careful about using images. As a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't include an image unless you're going to use it to talk about, unless you're going to directly refer to it. So if you're talking about someone, having a picture of them is fine. But you don't need a whole bunch of different pictures and things like that unless you're going to use them directly. So as a general rule, I wouldn't include an image unless it's directly connected, and especially you want it to be something you're going to directly refer to. Absolutely, positively, do not use music or videos in your presentations. You only have a limited amount of time. Unless your presentation is particularly about a movie or a particular song, there's no reason to include music or videos, right? So if your presentation is analyzing a song, yeah, it may make sense to play like a minute of the song, but in general, you just should not do that. And you should never, ever use music in the background. That's I've had people try and do that, and I don't know why you would do that. It distracts people from paying attention to you. And the reason I say you shouldn't use a video is most of the time people will be like, okay, here's a video. Okay, that was my video. And then they don't describe it or analyze it or anything. So therefore, unless you have my special explicit permission in your presentation, don't use any music, don't use any videos. So there's a few other things you should think about when you're preparing your presentation. First of all, think of your audience. There is a tendency, I think, when we're presenting, to try and squeeze as much as we can on one slide. It's just easier, right? When you're making a PowerPoint presentation, you just write a whole bunch of stuff on the slide and boom, you're done. And it's kind of a pain, right? If you make another slide and you move some of the information there. But you got to think of your audience, right? If you probably have been and watched someone give a presentation where they have a slide that has just too much information on it, and so the font becomes so small you can barely read it. So you don't want to do that, right? Make sure that you think of your audience and what might be pleasant for them to look at. And that's important, right? You don't want to just jam a whole bunch of stuff on your slide. In addition, you don't want to put your whole presentation on your slide. You have probably been in a class where the professor has read from the slide, and remember how boring that was. And a lot of times that's a sign that the person doesn't really understand what they're talking about, right? If you have to read your slides, you probably don't really understand the material. The only exception, of course, is a quote. When you're quoting someone, it does make sense to read the slide because you want to get their exact words. But the way I use words on a PowerPoint slide is just to remind me what I'm supposed to talk about. I know what it is I'm talking about. It's just I sometimes need a little bit of a reminder to help me see the order of things and to make sure that I cover every important point. So don't put your everything on there. Don't read your slides. Use your PowerPoint as an outline. And one thing, again, I just want to emphasize, treat your PowerPoint like a rough draft. You want to make sure that you've checked it multiple times for spelling mistakes. You want to make sure that you have run spell check. And it's always good to have someone else double check it. And I highly encourage you to practice not only on your own, but with an audience. Right? You run through and you practice it multiple times. You may be nervous, and this is a great way to not be nervous, is to practice it. Right? To say it so many times that you basically have the darn thing memorized. That's an excellent way to make sure that you really understand it. Now, one last thing I just want to talk about that may be of some use to you when you prepare your presentation is how to use the print screen command. You probably already know this, but let's say you're trying to get an image, you're trying to get something off your computer, and it's just really hard to get. Or let's say you want to use a still from a movie that you can play on your computer, but you don't really want to show, or you can't show the movie in class. In that case, you would just get that on your screen, the image on your computer screen that you want to show, and then hit the print screen button. And then you can actually paste that. You can do the edit paste command to paste that into a PowerPoint slide. And then you can even crop it. You can even use the crop command to crop out unnecessary information. You just right click on the image and then the crop command should show up. So you can see here where I made a screenshot. I hit print screen on the previous slide, and then I copy pasted the image into PowerPoint, and then I right clicked on the image, and you can see at the top there that it says crop. Right there, and you can see I added an arrow pointing at the crop command. And if you click that, after right-clicking on the image, if you click crop command, that will allow you to change what is being displayed. So you can crop out things that you don't like you could crop out that stuff at the bottom that you don't want people to see when you're doing your presentation. And what happens once you hit crop, you can see here, and I've got an arrow pointing down at it, you can see that there's these little black bars all around, and if you click on those, you can drag them around to make the image bigger or smaller, so that way you can delete parts so that they won't be seen by your audience. And that's a way that you can, like I said, you can take a scene from a movie or something, or from something else that for whatever reason you can't just download a JPEG or something. This is a way you can convert it and then manipulate it. And I often use this when I teach. It makes things very, very easy. So now on to how you actually give a presentation. First of all, it's important to have multiple backups of your presentation. You want to have one that you have emailed to yourself. You also want to have one on a USB drive. And I would also recommend that you actually physically print out your presentation and bring it with you. I have been to a conference before where the projector didn't work. So people weren't able to use their PowerPoints. And the problem with is that at a conference, you only have a limited time for each panel. So it'll be a panel of 3 or 4 people, and you may have an hour, which would mean each person would get 15 or 20 minutes at most. And if you aren't able to present because there's a technological issue, everyone loses time. So I had actually printed out my PowerPoint. So I said, they're trying to fix the the projector. I can go ahead and give my presentation. And I mean, it wasn't ideal. I had my PowerPoint in my hand, the printout, and then I looked at it to remind myself what I was supposed to talk about. And then after I finished each slide, I would hand it around to the audience so they could look at the images that I had included. It wasn't ideal, but the point was, even though there was a technological glitch, I was still ready. I could still give my presentation. And then while I was giving my presentation, they fixed the projector, and then everyone was able to present as normal. So it worked out really well. And trust me on this, you don't want to be in that situation. You're already going to be nervous giving a presentation. And it's really terrible when your presentation just you start off with a technological glitch or something like that. And it's very, very important that you have these multiple backups because you never know what one won't work. I was once at a presentation where a student had, I don't know how they did it, but they had their presentation on their phone in some form, and they were trying to get it onto the computer, and it just didn't work. And I think they were standing up there in front of the audience for like 5 to 10 minutes trying to finagle with this thing to get it to work. And I don't think it ever did work. And just imagine how embarrassing that was for that poor student who was up there trying to, play with electronics. Everyone kind of sat back and watched them do it, right? It's not fun. And this is why I require students to send me their presentation early, because what I like to do is I actually set up everything on a specific drive or something like that myself, so that it's all ready, and also I can test it to make sure that it works. And what that means is when you present, I've already got everything set up, and everything goes very, very smoothly, right? Because it's already up there. And that's important. You do not want, you're going to be very nervous when you're giving your presentation. You want smooth transitions. And that differs, the way I do that maybe differs for each class. So make sure to follow my instructions for the specific class. But in general, like I said, you want multiple backups, including a printed off version. And it's good to get that done very, very early. I think it's better to avoid reading directly from something when possible, excepting for quotes. Sometimes people want to read their paper, and sometimes people want to look at note cards and read from those. And I'm okay with that to a certain degree. I mean, if you're just so nervous that you have to read something, then that's fine. But remember, it's just not very exciting to hear someone read. And also sometimes I think people use that as a crutch so they don't actually have to learn their presentation. But if you practice your presentation a lot and you really know it by heart, then and you just will need the PowerPoint and the notes to help you. But you just want to be careful as much as possible not to read to people. It's very boring to have someone read their presentation. But like I say, if you need note cards or something like that to help you, that's fine. But I think it's better to use them in an outline form. When you give a presentation, it's very important to be cognizant of how you speak. You need to speak slowly, clearly, and loudly. Sometimes when people get nervous, they speak quickly. Sometimes when they get nervous, their speech is not very clear. And sometimes they get so scared that they speak in a very, very quiet voice. And it's important that you speak loudly enough that everyone can hear and understand you. So you just want to, and that's one reason why you want to always practice your presentation in front of an audience, because audience will tell you, I can't understand you, right? Or speak up, please. So this is one reason why it's always good to practice. You also want to be aware of body language. People, and this is again why it's good to present in front of someone who can give you some advice, but people will generally will often have like kind of nervous habits, like they put their hands in their pockets, they cross their arms. One of the most annoying and kind of odd body language issues I've noticed is that people will sometimes walk forward like 2 steps back. They'll walk 2 steps forward, and then they'll walk like 2 steps back, and they'll walk 2 steps forward, and they'll walk 2 steps back. And it's really weird to watch, but lots of people do it. So you really want to concentrate on not having any kind of distracting issues with body language. And sometimes what can help too is you want to move around the room, and you can just remind yourself, okay, at this slide I should move to this part of the room, or something like that. But it's just important to be aware of it. And the key thing is this is why you want to practice in front of an audience member. The final issue I want to talk about is just eye contact. Again, this is why you don't want to read, because you need to periodically look at your audience. You don't need maybe a second or two. You just look at someone and then you move on to another person or something like that. You don't really want to stare at people, but you also don't want to hide from people. And again, this is something to practice when you are in front of an audience member. So that's just audience. So like I say, giving a presentation I don't think is actually too difficult as long as you have practiced ahead of time, and in particular if you practice in front of someone. And that's very important because they're going to catch things like odd things and so forth. And also, if you are in the habit of practicing in front of people, that means you actually have to have your presentation ready ahead of time. And that helps a lot, right? Just getting things done ahead of time will help a great deal. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the importance of being a good audience member. It's whether you are presenting in a class or not, it's always important to give your full attention to the people who are presenting. One thing I can tell you as a teacher, that The way that the atmosphere of the class influences how well I teach. When I come into a class where people are friendly and interested and excited to learn, I'm a better teacher. I can feel that. I get energy from that. On the other hand, if people are tired, if I'm like, okay, that person's on their phone, do I call them on it right now or do I wait? That distracts me, and I don't do as good of a job teaching. And you can imagine how nervous you are to give a presentation, right? Imagine how much worse that is when someone is goofing off or not paying attention or doing something distracting, right? I have been horrified when I've been to student presentations where students would openly use cell phones while other students were presenting. And this was shocking to me because this happened in presentations that attendance wasn't required. So these were people who didn't have to come. They chose to come and then used their phones while other people were presenting, very openly and very obviously. And that was extraordinarily rude. And, imagine, you're nervous enough giving your presentation and looking out at the audience, instead of seeing eager, friendly faces who are listening closely to you, you see people who aren't paying attention, who are goofing off, who are laughing, chatting with their friends, using a phone or something like that. That's really terrible, bluntly speaking, and disrespectful. And it's just something you want to avoid. So make sure that when you come in and you're taking part in a presentation, that you are very respectful and attentive to the person presenting. I think that's something that's very important.